So I'm going to start off with the most basic of watercolour techniques. So let's try a little bit of wet in wet to create soft edges. So I'm mixing up a puddle of Hansa yellow light. Always mix up plenty of paint. So to paint wet in wet, you've got to wet your surface. So I'm wetting the surface with a size 8 brush right up to the edge. And you'll be able to contain your paint within that area. You can see it's very glossy, and that means it's very wet. So I'm painting wet into wet. Watch how the paint travels really quickly when you paint wet into wet. So that's when the consistency of paint is the same consistency of what's on the surface there. And you get beautiful soft edges. And remember to load your brush with the same consistency of paint to paper. When you paint wet in wet, sometimes you'll get puddles. As you can see here, I've got a puddle. So I've rinsed my brush. I've taken the excess paint off on the paper towel to allow the brush to behave almost like a sponge and soak up the water and paint. These puddles can be quite tricksy, especially if they bleed into a drying painting, because they can cause cauliflowers and blooms. So it's important to make sure you soak up the puddles. Another basic technique to practice is damp into wet. And that's when the paint is thicker, so more paint, less water, onto a wet surface, which is what I've done there. You can see the tonal value is stronger and it doesn't move as much as it does when you're painting wet into wet. So you've got more control. Plus you've got a little bit more of a definite edge, but it's still a soft edge. Next, I'm going to use the technique of painting damp into damp. So I'm mixing up creamier paint, less water, wiping the excess paint off on the paper towel. So my brush is damp. I'm painting on the damp surface. So there's not such a glossy shine now. It's more of a sheen, almost a satin sort of surface there. And I'm blending here to create this stronger tonal value with a thicker paint and just creating sort of the dark on the left hand side, but you can see there's still a lovely soft edge. So I'm going to continue working damp into damp, building up the sort of tonal value. So I'm adding Pyrolle Red with the Hansa Yellow Deep, taking the excess paint off there, and then working on the left hand side, damp into damp, and look at that for control. Now the control comes because you've made the paint thicker, you've taken the excess paint off, and enables you to blend, which is such a useful technique in watercolour painting. So you're blending the edges and the colours as well, building up the tonal values to create a 3D object. So I've mixed up some burnt sienna in there with the red and the yellow, and just painting a little bit more of that stronger tonal value on the left, right next to the edge, using the paper towel to make sure that my brush doesn't get too wet. If you use a wet wash going into a drying wash or a damp wash, you may get a cauliflower or bloom. So it's quite nice to know how to achieve a bloom or cauliflower, but also how to avoid them. So I've added some ultramarine to the burnt sienna. There's hardly any water now. It's literally tubed paint here, wiping off the excess moisture and really just blending right on the edge. You notice the paint doesn't spill over the edge because I didn't wet that area. So that's a dry area. So you've got the control here. So the paint doesn't travel anywhere where the paint is dry unless you paint on that area with the brush. So just building up these darker tonal values now right on the edge. So as you can see on the right hand side of my egg, I've literally left the white of the paper, and then you've got the light yellow, the medium yellow, the sort of darker orange, and then the darker browns and blues to create this 3D object. I've rinsed my brush and I'm taking off the excess water so the brush is damp, and I'm using this clean damp brush, which I refer to a lot in my demonstrations as a way of blending colours, and that's exactly what I've done there. So it's a really useful technique. What I'm going to talk about now is wet on dry technique, which creates hard edges. So I'm mixing up a puddle of pink. So I'm going to paint this wet on dry. So I haven't wet the surface. In order for me to keep the highlight, I've painted around it. So you get a hard edge there, which can be quite tricky on a rounded object where you want it a bit softer. So I'm going to show you how to soften that later. So you notice I load my brush continually, and that's just to make sure the paint is consistent. It's got the same consistent wetness. A lot of times I've noticed students is they load their brush and they will paint and paint until they run out of paint. But what happens there is the last bit of paint they've painted is quite dry. So when they go in with a wet brush, when they load again, they've got an uneven wetness. So if you go in and with very wet paint onto drying paint, and you get tidal marks and cauliflowers, so just keep loading your brush and painting. So this is ultramarine. I'm mixing the colours now on the paper, wet into wet at the top bit where the blue goes into the pink, but wet on dry as I work my way down to the bottom of the egg. And I've added a little bit more pink and blue mix there. Remember, keep the paint consistency the same. It's a lovely way of mixing paint sort of on the paper. You get some beautiful colour mixes rather than mixing it in the palette. So mixing up a little bit more of the ultramarine wet into wet on the left side here to build up the tonal value and to mix the colours. I'm using a clean damp brush to soften the hard edge here. It's a way of softening hard edges when you need to. Just keep rinsing your brush, taking the excess water off in the paper towel, and then soften and blend. I'm mixing up a creamier pink and I'm going to work damp into wet. So I'm using my size 8 round brush and just building up the tonal value here, but also blending and mixing the colours on the paper. So just working my way down to the bottom here. You can see how much control you have working damp into wet, as long as your paint consistency stays the same. If you're worried about it, always take off the excess paint on the paper towel. And it's a great way of practicing these techniques using simple shapes. You can build up the confidence in your watercolour painting. Again, I am blending with a clean, damp brush. I've rinsed the brush, taking the excess paint off here and blending that edge there, blending it into the lighter pink. It gives you so much control. I'm mixing up the ultramarine with the pink in the palette this time. Taking off the excess paint, I'm just blending the darker tonal value on the left hand side, damp into damp with my size 8 brush. Mixing up even more ultramarine and pink now, literally straight from the tube or pans. So less water, more paint. And I've added a pinch of burnt sienna as well, just to make this colour darker, painting right on the edge with my size 8 brush. Damp into damp there. You can see the control you have. You're creating a soft edge, but the paint isn't running now because it's so creamy. A little bit more ultramarine just to create the dark right at the bottom using the tip of my brush. I'm lifting off here using a clean damp brush. The paint ran in too much here. So if it does that, you can lift off with your clean damp brush, not a wet brush. If it's wet, that water will run into the damp paint to create a cauliflower. So again, rinse brush, take off excess paint off on the paper towel, and you can lift off. So mixing up a puddle of yellow here. I've got a mixture of the Hansa yellow light and deep, and I'm painting wet on dry with my size 8 brush. Remember to load your brush and paint so you get a consistency of paint. I'm going to blend some of the colours now, a little bit of sap green, wet into wet into the yellows there. So you get some lovely colour mixes. So it's a really great way of practicing sort of colour mixing. Mixing up some sap green with Paynes grey at the bottom here and painting wet into the sap green and wet on dry as I go towards the bottom of the egg. Dropping a little bit more yellow here and there, having a bit of fun now, experimenting. So once you learn all the rules, you can sort of break all the rules. So adding a little bit more of the Paynes grey and sap green at the bottom, and just carefully using the tip of my brush to create that sort of dark there at the bottom. I'm dropping in now paint that's wet into damp. So you get the paint sort of almost like a little explosions of colour. So it's quite nice to create these different effects, but at least you know why you're getting them. So it's quite nice for foliage or anything sort of organic, etc. So mixing up here a little bit more dark green here at the bottom using the tip of the brush. So just experiment with these different techniques so you get the timing and the feeling of the watercolor. So I'm just playing here, dropping wet washes into damp washes and just experimenting. So I'm going to do a mini loose landscape, wetting the paper with clean water with my size 8 brush. Dropping in some cerulean wet into wet. You can see how quickly that paint moves. Dropping in some phthalo blue now at the edge, slightly darker blue, so just varying the colours, letting them mix on the paper as well. A little bit more of the phthalo blue and water at the bottom there, and just letting it bleed into that cerulean. And just working my way to the bottom, pretty much wet on dry, rinsing the brush, getting a little bit of phthalo green at the top here. So sort of painting in some trees, pretty much damp into wet there. A little bit more of the cerulean at the top, letting it bleed. So this is the lovely thing about watercolor. Once you kind of learn the rules, you can start experimenting and trying them out. What I would suggest is use your sketchbooks to do this so it builds up confidence so you don't get precious about the paper. So it sort of allows you the freedom. So I'm working my way around the edge. You can see there's a watercolor bead there. So I'm just working that bead to paint around the edge, but I will need to deal with that, otherwise it will create a cauliflower. So just carefully working around the edge using the tip of the brush. One way of dealing with the bead is to tilt it. So I'm tilting it here, allowing the paint to flow into the wet paint. And you can create some wonderful effects this way as well. So tilting back the other way, getting that bead to come away from the edge. And I'm kind of building up this sort of semi-abstract landscape inside this egg shape, of course. Painting damp into damp with sap green and Paynes grey with my size 8 brush at the bottom here. So it's kind of the foreground grasses maybe. And again, it's a great way of just trying out different techniques, using the tip of the brush, pulling up that paint to create sort of tree trunks or maybe long grasses. So I'm going to leave that egg for now and do some prep for another one of my eggs using masking fluid. So I'm starting off with some liquid soap and I'm dipping my brush into the soap, and that will protect the brush while I use the masking fluid. So here is the masking fluid. So I'm going to dip my brush into the masking fluid and apply it to the dry watercolor paper. And what masking fluid does, it reserves the white of the paper. So wherever you apply it, that paper underneath will be protected. You need to let the masking fluid dry naturally. If you apply heat to masking fluid, it can be very tricky to remove. So what I'm doing here is I'm masking out a sort of a design for the Easter egg. So all of this area, once you remove the masking fluid, will have little white dots, etc. So I'm just using the tip of my liner brush here, coated with the liquid soap, and I'm just creating this little pattern here on the Easter egg. And I'm going to allow the masking fluid to dry naturally and come back to this egg later. So going back to my egg here on the right, I'm working damp into damp with Paynes grey with a pinch of the sap green, using the liner brush to create tree trunks. And it creates these lovely long thin lines with soft edges, creating some of the foliage now with that sap green and Paynes grey, damp into damp using the liner brush. So you can see how you can start using the different techniques, and this would be quite useful for distant trees because of the soft edges. They will appear further away. So I'm just building up the detail here, damp into damp. I'm going to sprinkle some table salt onto the damp paint there, all over, and this will absorb the paint to create lovely light textures. So I'm going to allow the painting to dry naturally to allow the salt to work. So I'm using resist for my next technique. So I'm using an oil bar. You can use a wax candle. And I'm drawing a pattern on the Easter egg using the oil bar, and that will resist the watercolor. And I'm using a light colored oil bar, and it's going to behave a little bit like the masking fluid, but it will stay there permanently where you will take off the masking fluid. and it's not as exact or precise as the masking fluid, especially kind of a chunky oil bar. So if you like loose watercolors, you'll like this technique. So I'm going to wet the paper with water with my size 8 round brush, and I'm going to use Brusho to sprinkle onto the wet surface. Now, if you want to learn more about Brusho, I'll put a link for a tutorial I published all about Brusho in the description below. So I've pierced a hole in the top of the drum of the Brusho, and I'm tapping the bottom to allow the pigment to fall onto the wet surface, and you have these tiny little explosions of colour, and it's really fun to use, but it is very messy and not for the faint-hearted. But as you can see, it creates some lovely effects. I'm just using slightly different colours here to create my very own design for my Easter egg here, using the Brusho and the wax resist technique, and just using my brush just to fill in any sort of white patches here and there. So now I'm going to paint another little scene using the techniques I've showed you. So I'm just painting a sky here, wet on dry, with some cerulean and my size 8 brush. And I've left a little cloud shape there as well. Adding a little bit more dark here with ultramarine and burnt sienna at the top there, creating darker tonal values. And I'm using a little bit more of the cerulean going down to the horizon. Mixing some pink here, wet into wet at the horizon. Mixing those colours on the paper, as I've shown you earlier. Rinsing my brush and adding some yellow there below the pink, going down into the sort of landscape. I'm lifting off now using a damp, clean paper towel to lift off the clouds here. So make sure you wring out all the water on the damp paper towel, so it's not too wet, otherwise you may get cauliflowers. But it's a nice way of lifting off paint because you get lovely natural soft edges. I find sometimes if you use a dry paper towel, you almost print the pattern from the paper towel. Mixing up some of the sap green here, I'm painting damp into damp there on the horizon, but wet on dry beneath. And then just adding some of the darker green here, working damp into damp with my size 6 brush, using a mixture of the sap green, phthalo green and Paynes grey, varying the heights of the trees. Adding a little bit more darker green here, sap green mixed with Paynes grey, building up those tonal values. I've got a very dilute raw sienna here, and I'm painting a path leading to the horizon there to create depth, using linear perspective, using wider marks in the foreground, narrow as it goes towards the horizon, using a bit of ultramarine burnt sienna here with my size 6 brush, painting wet on dry this dark brown either side of the path. And I'm going to use a plastic card technique to swipe this paint to create the look of rock. So I'm using all the sort of different techniques I use in my watercolor tutorials, and it's a great way of practicing these. So just painting on the right hand side here, pretty much wet on dry, this damp paint so it doesn't bleed into that path, so I've got some control there. And I've got very thick creamy paint. I'm just painting some fence posts here on the horizon, damp into damp. I'm using a plastic card to swipe that paint there. Once the sheen goes off the paint and it's not too dry, swipe once. If the paint runs back in on itself, just wait a little bit longer. It's too wet to use this technique, but it's such a useful technique, especially creating the look of rocks. And again, going back in to paint some more fence posts here, using very creamy burnt sienna and Paynes grey with my size 6 brush. The painting has dried off a little, and I'm painting a person using my size 4 round brush, using Paynes grey and burnt sienna. And I will put a link for a people painting tutorial that I published in the description below. It will give you more information about painting people. I've just added a little bit of a red scarf there to really add interest to the person and to make them into the focal point, adding a little bit more detail and shadow as well to ground the person so they don't look like they're floating. I'm using a spattering technique to create some texture on the path, and I'm masking out the painting with a piece of paper towel. So I'm using a natural sponge now, dipping it into water, wringing out all the water so the sponge is damp and not wet. Mixing up some creamy paint here using sap green, painting on the sponge now, and I'm going to sponge my painting here damp into damp just to create some texture and bring forward some of those trees to create depth in my painting. I thought it'd be quite nice to sponge this Easter egg here. It's just a good way of practicing, so it is quite abstract. When you're sponging, press very gently, not too hard, or you'll get a splodge. This way you get lots of beautiful textures that resemble foliage, etc. So I'm going to use a watercolour pencil and sandpaper now. I'm rubbing the tip of the watercolour pencil against the sandpaper. It releases the pigment, as you can see here. I'm spritzing the pigment with a spritzer bottle and just water. As you can see, it dilutes the watercolour pencil, creating a wash. You can also use the watercolour pencil and sandpaper by wetting the paper and then doing the same thing, this time letting the pigment fall onto the wet surface, and you get the most amazing textures by doing this technique. You can also use the watercolour pencil and draw into the wet surface, and you get these lovely soft edges. It's a great way, if you don't like using thin lines with a brush in watercolour, you can actually use a watercolour pencil in this way. It just makes it so much easier to draw thin lines, and it still gives you that lovely sort of watercolour effect. So I'm just building up the design on my Easter egg now, using the watercolour pencil onto damp paper. So I'm just wetting the paper now over the dried masking fluid, just using clean water, adding a very pale pink here now. So again, just creating a design for my Easter egg, painting wet into wet. So just using those techniques again. Now I'm working wet into damp. So it's kind of breaking the rules, but under a kind of controlled circumstance. So you've got these little explosions of colour. Mixing up more of that pink there, and I'm just going to drop in a little bit more of the wet paint into the damp surface there, creating this lovely sort of pattern. Mixing up some Pyrolle Red now and just dropping that in here and there, allowing the paint to sort of mix on the paper as well, those two colours. So I'm using some of the Brusho as well, a little bit of pink Brusho here to create some textures on to the wet paint. Now this painting has dried off and you can see the lovely textures the salt has created here. Thought it'd be quite nice to show you a lifting off technique using a clean damp brush. Now my painting has dried here. I'm using a flat brush and taking the excess water off on my paper towel. I'm just using the brush like a sponge and lifting off the paint. You have to keep repeating cleaning the brush, otherwise your brush will get contaminated and you won't get these lovely light clean lines. It also shows you that watercolour isn't permanent, so you can imagine if you're working on a dried wash with another wash on top and you go back and forth, you can actually disturb the paint underneath. So if you are working on top of a dried wash, make sure you glide your brush carefully over that paint below. Otherwise, you could disturb that paint and create muddy washes. So as you saw there, I'm using a paper towel to lift off that paint as well to create these lovely light patterns. So I'm just using some dark green now, Paynes grey and sap green with my size 4 round brush. I'm just adding a few more patterns to my egg here, building up those details wet on dry. Few more details here and there, and I've decided to add a little bit of detail and shadows to my path wet on dry and then blend with a clean damp brush. So I'm going to remove the masking tape with framing tape. You can use a putty rubber or even your thumb. So just removing it here, and here are the finished Easter eggs. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial showing you the basic techniques of watercolour and some experimental techniques as well, and putting them into practice. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section below. And if you'd like to learn more about watercolour, get access to exclusive videos and downloadable outline sketches, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about that can be found in the description below, and you can cancel anytime. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.